Long ago, in a land where winter lasted nearly the whole year, and forests of birch and pine stretched for leagues so dense that the sun could scarcely pierce the treetops, there lived, in a small village on the banks of a frozen river, a merchant named Stepan Ivanovich. He was a man of modest means, but a generous heart, and he lived happily alongside his wife, a woman of serene face and skillful hands, and their daughter, a girl with hair as fair as ripe wheat, named Vasilisa. From a young age, Vasilisa was admired by everyone who knew her, not only for the beauty already taking shape in her delicate features, but for the quiet kindness with which she treated even the humblest creatures in the yard. Wounded little birds, the stray dogs that wandered the village in search of a scrap of bread. Yet the happiness of that household was not meant to last. When Vasilisa was only 8 years old, her mother fell ill with a sickness the healers of the region could neither name nor cure. The woman wasted away over the course of an entire winter, and sensing that death was drawing near, like the mist that rises from the river on cold mornings, she called her daughter to her room one night when the moon could barely break through the thick clouds. "My child," she said, her voice already weak but her eyes still shining with love, "I am about to go to a place from which no one returns. Before that happens, I want to give you a blessing and a gift. Take this doll." And from beneath her pillow she drew a small cloth doll, wearing a dress embroidered in red thread and a kerchief tied about its head, just as the peasant women of that land wore. "Keep her always with you, hidden where no one can see her. Whenever you are in trouble, give her a little food and a sip of water and ask her advice. She will help you, for she carries within her my blessing as a mother, and no mother's blessing is ever lost, even after the body fades like a candle." Weeping, Vasilisa promised she would never part with the doll. Days later her mother died, and was buried in a small cemetery ringed by bare birch trees, where the wind sang sad stories among the branches. The girl kept the doll in the pocket of her apron, and at night, when no one could see her, she would take a small piece of bread from her own meal, offer it to the doll, and whisper her fears and doubts to her. And strange as it may seem, the doll, after eating, seemed to gain a soft glow in its cloth eyes, and Vasilisa would always find, by the next morning, the solution to whatever troubles were weighing on her. Time passed, as it always does, carrying with it the heaviest grief, and Stepan Ivanovich, fearing his daughter would grow up without a woman's care in the house, decided to marry again. He chose a widow from the neighboring town, a woman of pleasant appearance and sharp conversation, who already had 2 daughters from a previous marriage. At first glance, it seemed to Stepan that he had made a good choice, for his new wife knew how to behave sweetly in his presence. But what the merchant could not see, for love and loneliness sometimes blind even the most sensible of men, was what lay hidden behind that rehearsed smile. As soon as the marriage was settled, and as soon as Stepan began traveling frequently on business, carrying his wares to distant fairs, the stepmother's mask began to slip, revealing a face full of envy and cruelty. The woman saw in Vasilisa everything her own daughters lacked: natural beauty, gracefulness of movement, a gentleness in her gaze that drew praise from every visitor to the house. And the more Vasilisa was praised, the more she came to be hated in the eyes of the stepmother and her 2 stepsisters. Subtle persecutions began then, disguised as household duties. Vasilisa was the first to rise and the last to sleep. It fell to her to fetch water from the farthest well, even though a closer one existed, reserved for the sisters. It fell to her to wash clothes in the freezing river, chop firewood, light the stove, bake the bread, sweep the floor, mend the clothing, all while the other 2 girls spent their days combing their hair before small, polished metal mirrors, complaining about any task assigned to them. And yet, no matter how much they wore her down with work, trying to wither her beauty through exhaustion and deprivation, Vasilisa only bloomed all the more, as if the kindness she carried within her were nourishment enough to sustain both body and face. And this, far from soothing the stepmother's hatred, only fanned its flames, for she believed, never once suspecting the doll hidden in the apron pocket, that some enchantment was at work, something that had to be destroyed. It was then that the stepmother devised a cruel plan, taking advantage of one of Stepan Ivanovich's long business trips. The family's house stood at the edge of an immense forest, so vast that the village elders said it stretched to where the earth met the sky. And in the heart of that forest, according to legends passed down from grandmother to granddaughter beside the fire, there lived a terrible creature, Baba Yaga, the ancient witch, mistress of bones and of the night, who flew through the air in a great stone mortar, rowing with a pestle, and sweeping away her own tracks with a broom made of dried herbs, so that no one could follow her to her dwelling. Her house was an isba, a wooden hut, that stood upon two enormous chicken legs, and which spun on its own, turning its door now toward the forest, now toward emptiness, now toward whoever approached, speaking the right words. Around the hut stood a fence made not of wood, but of human bones, crowned with skulls, whose hollow sockets glowed at night like embers, lighting the witch's way as she returned from her hunts. It was said that Baba Yaga devoured anyone unfortunate, or bold, enough to come too near her dwelling, and that very few indeed, had ever returned to tell what they had seen. The stepmother knew these stories well, and it was on them precisely that she based her plan. One autumn night, as the wind had already begun to whistle through the cracks in the wooden walls, she gathered the three girls in the main room of the house, each given a task. One was to knit, another to make lace, and Vasilisa was given spinning. The stepmother then, on some pretext, snuffed out every candle in the house except one, which she placed strategically close to herself and her true daughters, so that its light would not reach the corner where Vasilisa worked. "Oh, how careless of me," said one of the sisters, feigning surprise, as she accidentally knocked over the only candle still burning, plunging the entire room into total darkness. "What shall we do now?" asked the stepmother, her voice calculated, brimming with feigned concern. "We cannot work in the dark, and the stove's fire has already gone out. Someone must go fetch light." "I won't go," said the first. "Sister," with a wicked smile no one could see in the dark, "my spindle glows on its own. I have plenty of light here." "Neither will I," said the second in the same tone. "My knitting needles glow too. I don't need any more light." And both, of course, were lying, for they had arranged everything beforehand with their mother. "Then only Vasilisa is left," the stepmother concluded, with false reluctance. "Vasilisa, your spinning doesn't glow the way your sister's work does. You must go into the forest to Baba Yaga's house and borrow a bit of fire. Only then can we continue our work." Vasilisa's heart froze in her chest at those words. Everyone in the village knew what it meant to approach the dwelling of the Bone Witch, but there was no way to refuse an order from the stepmother with her father away, and though she trembled, the girl rose, took her thickest shawl, and before leaving, ran to the dark corner of the yard, took the doll from her apron pocket, gave her a piece of bread and a little water she had set aside beforehand, and whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "Little doll, my dear, help me. I must go to Baba Yaga's house to ask for fire, and I am so afraid my whole body is shaking." The doll, as always, ate the bread in silence, and then, in a voice as thin as the whisper of wind through dry leaves, answered, "Do not be afraid, Vasilisa. Go where you have been sent, but carry me with you always, kept close to your heart, and no harm shall reach you while I am near." Comforted, though not entirely free of fear, Vasilisa tied her shawl tightly, tucked the doll close to her heart, crossed herself 3 times before the icon on the entryway wall and stepped out into the night toward the dark forest. The first hours of walking were not as terrible as she had feared. The moon, between tattered clouds, cast a pale glow over the path, enough for her to make out the narrow trail among the tall, twisted trunks. But as she walked on, the forest seemed to close in around itself, the trees drawing closer and closer together, branches intertwining like bony fingers above her head, blocking out more and more of the light. The sounds of the night changed too. At first there were crickets and the distant rustling of some nocturnal creature. Then, gradually, they became whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once, muffled groans among the roots, a short, sharp laugh that echoed and vanished before she could be certain she had truly heard it. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed along the path ahead. Vasilisa pressed herself against the trunk of a tree, her heart racing, and saw a horseman ride past before her, swift as lightning, mounted on a horse as white as purest snow, dressed all in white, a soft glow emanating from his figure, as though he himself were made of the light of dawn. The horseman passed and vanished around the bend in the path, and almost at the same instant the sky beyond the trees began to lighten faintly. Dawn was arriving. Vasilisa walked the entire day, without coming across so much as a hut, without crossing paths with a single traveller. In the afternoon, as the sun began to set and shadows stretched long between the pines, a second horseman crossed her path. This one mounted on a horse red as burning coal, dressed in scarlet, with eyes that seemed like 2 blazing flames. The instant he vanished down the path ahead, the sun sank completely below the horizon, and darkness swallowed everything. It was then that the true terror of the journey began. Without moon or visible stars, through the dense canopy above, Vasilisa moved almost blindly, guided only by an instinct whose source she could not name. Perhaps it was the doll itself, kept close to her heart, silently guiding her steps. The trees seemed to shift whenever she looked away. She heard footsteps behind her that stopped the moment she turned around. Out of the corner of her eye she glimpsed pale shapes gliding among the trunks, vanishing before she could fix her gaze upon them. A distant howl, of a wolf or of something worse, tore through the silence, and she quickened her pace even more, feeling cold sweat run down her spine, despite the icy night air. It was then, just as fear threatened to freeze her completely in place, that she spotted, among the tree trunks, a reddish glow, flickering like a distant bonfire. Guided by that light, Vasilisa pushed her way through thorny bushes that tore at her shawl and scratched her arms until, at last, she reached a clearing, and there, before her, rose the most dreadful sight she had ever beheld in her short life. A tall fence enclosed an uneven yard, and that fence was not made of wood, as the ordinary fences of peasant huts were, but of human bones, stacked and bound together with dried sinew. Atop each post of the fence sat a human skull, and from within the hollow sockets of each skull glowed a reddish light, flickering like embers that never die out. This was the light she had glimpsed through the trees. The gate in the fence was made of human leg bones, crossed like sticks, and its hinges creaked with a sound that resembled a groan of pain. And in the center of that sinister yard rose the strangest hut human eyes had ever beheld, a wooden cabin darkened by time, standing not on foundations of stone, but on 2 enormous chicken legs, covered in thick scales and sharp claws dug into the muddy ground. The hut itself seemed to breathe, a faint tremor, running through its walls, as though it were alive, sleeping a light and wary sleep. Vasilisa nearly turned back, nearly fled back through the forest, no matter what horrors might await her on the return path. Anything seemed preferable to that sight. But at that very instant, a third horseman crossed the sky above the clearing, this one mounted on a horse black as the deepest darkness, dressed in black from head to toe, and the moment he passed and vanished among the bones of the fence, as, though passing through matter itself, night closed in completely, absolute, without even the faint glimmer of stars. And it was in that moment of utter darkness that Vasilisa heard, coming from somewhere above her, a terrible sound. A creak of tortured wood, followed by a sharp whistle cutting through the air, and then a hollow crash, as though an enormous stone were rolling across the sky. She raised her eyes, trembling, and saw, outlined against the faint reddish light still coming from the boar, skulls, the silhouette of Baba Yaga, flying inside an enormous stone mortar, rowing through the night air with a heavy wooden pestle used as an oar, while with a broom made of dried herbs she swept away behind her any trace of her passage through the sky. The witch was a sight that chilled the blood, gaunt to the bone, her skin wrinkled and greyish, stretched over a sharp-featured face and a long, hooked nose that nearly touched her pointed chin. One leg was made of pure bone without any flesh at all, and it struck against the side of the stone mortar with every movement, producing the sinister creaking Vasilisa had heard. Her hair, white and sparse, streamed loose in the wind like torn spiderwebs, and her eyes, her eyes, glowed with a yellowish fire that seemed to see through the darkness itself, through the very soul of anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. The mortar landed with a dull thud inside the bone-strewn yard, and Baba Yaga, still seated within it, raised her long nose and sniffed the night air like a wolf sensing nearby prey. "Fee, fee, fee," she grumbled, in a hoarse, cavernous voice that seemed to rise from the bottom of a well. "I smell Russian folk around here. Who dares approach my dwelling?" Vasilisa, trembling from head to toe, but remembering the doll's words, hidden close to her heart, gathered every last bit of courage still within her, and answered in the firmest voice she could muster, "It is I, grandmother. I am Vasilisa. My sisters sent me to borrow a bit of fire, for every flame in our house has gone out." Baba Yaga climbed down from the mortar with a movement strangely agile for a creature of such decrepit appearance, and walked toward the girl, her uneven steps making her bone leg clatter against the hard ground. She circled Vasilisa once, then again, sniffing her closely, as though appraising her the way a butcher appraises a cut of meat before deciding how to carve it. "I know that family," she said at last, with a smile that revealed teeth of blackened iron. "I know them well, but fire is not given for free, my dear. If you want to carry flame back to your house, you'll have to work for me first. If you complete everything I command, I will give you the fire. If you fail, well, then I shall simply eat you." A shudder ran through Vasilisa's entire body at hearing those words spoken with such casualness, as though eating a young girl were as ordinary a matter as baking a loaf of bread. But she had no choice. Turning back meant losing herself forever in the dark forest, and refusing meant certain death right then and there. And so she bowed her head in submission and said, "I will do as you command, grandmother." "Very good, very good," cackled Baba Yaga, satisfied. "Come in then, my pretty one. Let's see what you're made of." And the bone gate creaked open, as though it too felt pain in moving, allowing Vasilisa to cross that dreadful threshold. The Isba, sensing their approach, slowly turned upon its two chicken legs, its claws dragging deep furrows through the sodden earth, until its door faced them directly. Little Isba, turn your back to the forest and your door to me," murmured Baba Yaga, and the hut obeyed, finishing its turn with one last shudder. Inside, the surroundings were just as strange as the exterior suggested. A great brick oven took up nearly half of the single room, immense and dark, exhaling a stifling heat. The walls were decorated not with the usual embroidered tapestries of peasant huts, but with sinister objects, withered hands hung like decorative plants, jars of indefinable colored liquids bubbling with no visible flame beneath them, and in one corner, a cabinet whose doors seemed to open and close on their own, as though breathing. A black cat, thin and with glowing green eyes, sat upon a bench, watching the newcomer with an almost human attentiveness. "Sit, sit," said Baba Yaga, pushing Vasilisa toward a small wooden stool. "You must be hungry after such a long walk." And saying this, she began bringing out from inside the oven and the cupboards steaming dishes: cabbage soup, roasted meat, black bread still warm, kvass fermented in a clay jug. Vasilisa, despite the fear still knotting her stomach, ate a little, knowing that refusing the hospitality offered, sinister as her hostess might be, could be taken as an insult. As she ate, she felt the witch's piercing gaze upon her, studying her with an almost scientific curiosity, as one examines a rare specimen before deciding its fate. When the meal was finished, Baba Yaga cleaned her iron teeth with a long fingernail and said, "Now, my dear, tomorrow morning I must go out to attend to my affairs. While I am gone, you will clean this entire house, sweep the yard, wash my clothes, and prepare supper for when I return. And also," she added, a malicious glint in her yellow eyes, "you will separate, grain by grain, this sack of wheat mixed with dirt, putting the clean wheat on one side and the dirt and pebbles on the other. If when I return everything has been done as I commanded, you shall have your fire and may go. But if even one task is left undone—" She did not finish the sentence, but her iron-toothed smile said all that the words left unsaid. With that, she blew out the room's only candle with a dry breath, and darkness swallowed everything, leaving Vasilisa alone with her terrified thoughts, sitting in a corner of that house of horrors, unable to close her eyes, fearing that if she opened them again, she would find the witch looming over her. As soon as she was certain she was alone, she took the doll from her apron pocket, broke off a small piece of the bread left over from the meal, offered it to the doll, along with a sip of water kept in a small flask, and whispered, her voice choked with held-back tears, "Dear little doll, look at the impossible task I've been given. How am I to separate all this wheat from the dirt before dawn and still clean the whole house, wash the clothes and prepare supper? I have neither the time nor the strength for all of it." The doll, after consuming the offering, glowed softly in the darkness, and her thin little voice answered, "Do not worry, dear Vasilisa. Eat something yourself, drink a little water, and then sleep peacefully. Morning is always wiser than night. I will take care of everything while you rest." And trusting blindly in that promise, for over the years she had learned that the doll never failed her, Vasilisa ate a piece of bread, drank a sip of water, and finally, exhausted from the long walk and the accumulated terror, fell asleep in a corner of the izba, curled up on a hard wooden bench. Throughout the entire night as she slept, small invisible hands seemed to work tirelessly about the house, the sound of grains being separated, one by one, clinking against a metal bowl, the noise of water being poured and clothes being scrubbed, the crackling of fire being lit in the oven, and the aroma of food being prepared. But Vasilisa, sunk in a deep, dreamless sleep, witnessed none of it, and when she finally opened her eyes at daybreak, she found the izba spotlessly clean, the yard swept without a single leaf out of place, the witch's clothes washed and hung to dry, supper already simmering over a gentle fire, and the sack of wheat perfectly separated from the dirt, a golden pile on one side and a pile of dark earth on the other. Vasilisa had scarcely a moment to marvel at all this when she heard coming from outside that same hollow, sinister sound of the stone mortar descending from the sky. Baba Yaga had returned. The witch entered, sniffing the air, her yellow eyes sweeping every corner of the house in search of some mistake, some oversight that might justify her fury. But she found nothing. Everything was perfect, exactly as she had commanded. "Very well," she grumbled, a hint of poorly hidden disappointment in her voice, as though she would have preferred to find some reason to punish the girl. "Faithful servants indeed," and she called out, clapping 3 times, "My faithful servants grind this wheat." And suddenly 3 pairs of hands appeared out of nowhere, floating in the air, and seized the pile of separated wheat, carrying it outside the house where the sound of millstones began to grind. Baba Yaga then sat down at the table, serving herself the prepared supper, and as she ate with that voracious appetite that made the bones of the chicken she devoured crack between her iron teeth, she observed Vasilisa with heightened attention. "Why don't you ask me anything, girl?" she said at last, wiping the grease from her pointed chin with the back of her hand. "You sit there quiet as a mouse, but I know you have questions stuck in your throat. Speak, you may ask." Vasilisa hesitated, remembering an old piece of advice her own mother had given her while still alive, that not everything should be asked. For some answers bring more harm than good, but driven by curiosity about the horsemen she had encountered along the way, she took the risk. "Grandmother, if you'll permit me, I would like to know who the horsemen were that crossed my path in the forest. One white riding a white horse, one red riding a red horse, and one black riding a black horse." Baba Yaga smiled, a smile that mixed pride with something like pleasure at sharing her secrets. "Ah, those are my faithful servants. The white horseman is my bright day, the red horseman is my rising sun, and the black horseman is my dark night. They serve at my command and bring day and night according to my will." Vasilisa then very nearly asked about the floating hands that had carried the wheat, but the doll hidden in her pocket seemed to stir slightly, as if warning her, and the girl fell silent just in time. "So no more questions?" Baba Yaga pressed, her yellow eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "No, grandmother," Vasilisa answered cautiously. "As you yourself say, one who knows too much grows old too fast. I have learned enough for today." Baba Yaga laughed, a dry, cutting laugh, like the creak of an old door, and said, "You did well not to ask about my serving hands, clever girl. Here, I only devour those who ask too much about what happens inside my house, or those who ask too much about what happens outside it when they shouldn't know. You have good sense. Now tell me, how did you manage to finish every task I gave you? Did someone help you?" Vasilisa's heart raced, fearing that revealing the doll's existence might bring even greater danger, so she answered cautiously, "It was only my late mother's blessing that helped me, grandmother. Nothing more." At the word blessing, Baba Yaga's face twisted into an expression of revulsion and contained fury, as though the word itself tasted bitter in her mouth. "Ah, a blessing!" she spat, rising abruptly from the table. "A mother's blessing, is it? Get out of here then. I want no blessings in my house. Quickly, leave." And without wasting a moment, she pushed Vasilisa toward the yard, crossed with her through the creaking bone gate, and from atop the fence took down one of the skulls whose sockets still burned with that red and sinister light. "Here," she said, placing the skull into the girl's trembling hands, mounted on the tip of a long pole. "Here is the fire your sisters asked for. Take it home, since that is what you came for." And without another word, Baba Yaga turned her back and vanished into the izba, whose door slammed shut with a crash, as though the house itself wished to drive the intruder from its presence. Vasilisa wasted no time. Gripping tightly the pole with the flaming skull, its sockets lighting the path ahead with a red, flickering glow, she ran across the bone-strewn yard, left the creaking gate behind, and plunged once more into the darkness of the forest, no longer so terrified, for the skull's light drove away the shadows and strange sounds that had once pursued her. She walked through the whole night and part of the following day, guided by the eerie light she carried, until at last, exhausted but alive, she caught sight in the distance of the first huts of her home village. As she drew near her house, Vasilisa nearly threw away that terrible skull, thinking perhaps her family had already found fire by some other means, and that she no longer needed to carry that sinister burden. But a voice, perhaps the doll's own, perhaps only her intuition, whispered that she should carry it through to the end, just as she had been ordered. And it was good that she did. Upon entering the house, she found everything in total darkness. During the days Vasilisa had been away, not a single candle, not a single flame in the stove had managed to stay lit in the house. Every flame the stepmother or the sisters tried to light went out instantly, as if blown out by an invisible wind, and no borrowed match from the neighbors lasted more than a few seconds within those walls. The entire family had spent days living in cold and darkness, eating whatever cold food remained, shivering beneath their blankets, anxiously awaiting the return of the stepdaughter they had sent to certain death, secretly hoping she would never come back, and at the same time desperate for the fire whose absence her departure had caused. When Vasilisa entered, carrying the flaming skull on the tip of the pole, the stepmother and the two sisters rushed to meet her, relieved to finally have a source of light and warmth, however strange and sinister its origin might be. "Finally!" the stepmother exclaimed, trying to sound pleased, though her eyes betrayed a confused mixture of relief and disappointment at seeing her still alive. "Bring that inside, quickly! We're freezing in here!" But the moment Vasilisa set the skull down on the table in the main room, something terrible began to happen. The empty eyes of the skull, still burning with that red light brought directly from Baba Yaga's dwelling, slowly turned as though possessed of a will of their own, and fixed themselves one by one upon the stepmother and her two daughters. An unbearable heat began to radiate from the skull, growing with every passing second, as though that fire carried within it all the accumulated malice and every secret desire for vengeance that Vasilisa herself had never dared to voice aloud. The stepmother tried to run, tried to throw water on the skull, even tried to hurl it out of the house, but her hands seemed stuck to the object, as though some invisible force held her there, forcing her to face that vengeful fire. The two sisters screamed, trying to flee through the door, but the flaming eyes pursued them through the darkness of the house, burning everything they touched with their light. At dawn the next day, when the neighbors, alarmed by the screams heard during the night, finally dared approach the merchants' house, they found nothing but ashes where the stepmother had once stood, and of the two sisters only blackened remains, entirely consumed by Baba Yaga's relentless fire. Vasilisa, meanwhile, was found unharmed, sitting in the farthest corner of the house, the doll clutched to her chest, trembling not from fear, but from a confused and bitter relief. For although those women had caused her such suffering, no kind heart truly rejoices in another's destruction, however deserved it may seem. Quickly, fearing that the flaming skull itself might turn against her too, or that the flames might spread to consume the entire house, Vasilisa buried the glowing remains deep in the garden, far from anything that might catch fire, and there, over time, a small bush of white flowers grew that never withered, not even in the harshest winter. A strange, silent reminder of that terrible night. Alone in the house, with no stepmother, no stepsisters, and her father still away on his travels, Vasilisa went to live under the care of an elderly neighbor, a kind and discreet woman who took her in without asking too many questions about the strange events that had consumed the young woman's adoptive family. It was in that house, weeks later, that Vasilisa, one day, rummaging through an old wooden chest, found a handful of flax of exceptional quality. So fine and soft, it seemed almost impossible it could have grown from an ordinary plant. "Little doll," she said, taking her magical companion once more from her apron pocket and offering her bread and water as she always did, "what should I do with this beautiful flax?" "Bring me a small loom, the finest you can find," the doll replied, "and I will help you spin this flax into a cloth so delicate that no weaver in the kingdom has ever seen its like." Vasilisa asked the elderly neighbor for a small loom, and working together, the girl spinning by day, and at night when everyone slept, the doll continuing the work with supernatural skill, the two produced over the course of several weeks a fabric of such extraordinary beauty that it seemed woven of moonlight and mist, so fine it could pass entirely through the eye of an ordinary needle, and yet resilient and soft to the touch, glowing gently under any light that fell upon it. The elderly neighbor, marveling at such a creation, suggested that the fabric should not be wasted on ordinary clothing, but taken to the capital, where it might perhaps be sold at a fine price, or even offered to the Tsar himself, whose court was known for appreciating the rarest of fine things. Vasilisa, with the silent blessing of the doll, fashioned from the cloth a dozen shirts so perfect they seemed sewn by fairy hands, and the elderly neighbor, gathering her courage, carried them to the royal palace, offering them as a gift worthy of the sovereign himself. The Tsar, upon trying on one of those shirts, was so struck by the softness and flawless stitching, not a single flaw, not a crooked seam, that he demanded to know at once who had produced such a marvel. The elderly neighbor, fearing reprisal for being unable to fully explain the supernatural origin of the fabric, told only the truth she knew, that a young woman named Vasilisa, of rare skill and beauty, had spun and sewn it all with her own hands. "Bring her to me," ordered the Tsar, curious not only about her skill, but also about the mention of the young seamstress's beauty. Vasilisa was then summoned to the palace, and when the Tsar saw her for the first time entering the royal hall with timid but dignified steps, her hair fair as ripe wheat, framing a face of delicate features, and eyes that carried both sorrow and an almost otherworldly serenity, he fell instantly in love, as happens only in stories that endure across generations without losing their charm. "Was it you who made these wonderful shirts?" he asked, scarcely able to tear his gaze from that singular young woman. "Yes, Your Majesty," Vasilisa answered, bowing respectfully, "with the blessing of my late mother, who never abandoned me, even after leaving this life." The Tsar, moved by those words and by the quiet dignity with which they were spoken, no longer wished to part from that young woman whose story was gradually told to him in full. The early loss of her mother, the cruelty of her stepmother and stepsisters, the terrible journey to Baba Yaga's dwelling, and the tragic fate that finally befell those who had tried to destroy her. Moved and impressed by the young woman's strength of spirit, who had endured such horrors without losing the goodness of her heart, the Tsar asked for her hand in marriage that very same week. Vasilisa, feeling she had finally found safe harbor after so many storms, accepted the proposal, and the wedding celebrations lasted 3 full days, with abundant feasts and music echoing throughout the kingdom. Not long after, her father, Stepan Ivanovich, finally returning from his long business journey and finding the house empty and destroyed by mysterious fire, followed the rumors spreading along the roads about a young woman of rare beauty who had become queen, and discovered with tears of joy and of regret for having been absent at so crucial a moment that it was his very own daughter. Vasilisa welcomed him with open arms, holding no grudge for the absence that had unwittingly exposed her to so much danger, and he came to live in the palace alongside his daughter and son-in-law for the rest of his days. As for the doll, the faithful guardian who had journeyed with Vasilisa through every peril of that ordeal. Those who tell this story say she remained forever hidden close to the now queen's heart, receiving, even amid so much abundance and comfort in the palace, her daily bit of bread and her sip of water, as a quiet reminder that a mother's blessing is never truly extinguished, and that kindness, even in the face of the deepest fear, is always the flame that lights the way back home. And as for Baba Yaga, mistress of bones and shadows of the endless forest, she continued through the centuries that followed to haunt the dreams and tales of Russian children, her isba still turning eternally upon its chicken legs in some lost corner of the deepest forest, her stone mortar still cutting through the night sky, her 3 horsemen still faithfully bringing bright day, blazing sun, and dark night to every corner of the Russian land. It is said that she still waits, patient and unrelenting, for those who dare wander too far into the darkness of the forest, ready to judge with her terrible and ancient wisdom, who deserves the fire of life and who deserves to be devoured by eternal darkness. And that is why, to this day, when the wind blows hard through the bare birches of the Russian winter and the branches creak like intertwined bones in the night, grandmothers still whisper to their grandchildren, beside the protective warmth of the lit stove, that it is best not to stray too far from the known path, for somewhere among the deepest shadows of the forest, the old hut on chicken legs still turns, waiting, eternally waiting for the next brave or unwary soul who dares to knock upon its door of bones.